theyeshiva.net.
The last class ended with a discussion about the Tzemach Tzedek's initial acceptance of the Nesius. I want to go back and make a couple of mentions regarding that whole event of the Tzemach Tzedek becoming Rebbe. As I explained to you, there were 6 months between when the Mittel Rebbe was installed, between the Mittel Rebbe passed away, and the Tzemach Tzedek was officially Makabel the Nesius. The first thing I want to mention is a very interesting story. There were other candidates that I told you about besides for the Tzemach Tzedek that were theoretically up for the possibility of being Mamal the Makam of the Mittel Rebbe. One of them, of course, was the Mittel Rebbe's younger brother, Rabbi Chaim Avram, and another was the Fetter Yossi, an uncle of the Tzemach Tzedek's, and if I'm not wrong, he was the brother-in-law of Reb Shalom Shachne from a Zivik Sheni, from a second marriage. So the story was that after the Mittel Rebbe passed away, the Tzemach Tzedek had a kviyas to learn with Fetter Yossi, to learn together. He was a big gon, he was a big tzaddik, he was a gewaldige Baal Madrege, and the Tzemach Tzedek and his uncle had a regular kviyas to learn. Anyway, one day they were learning together, and they came across something which they could not understand. And the shiur, the learning, ended with a lack of clarity on this question. At night, both of them had the same dream. Both of them dreamt that the Alter Rebbe came into the two of them as they were learning, and they had the question, and the Alter Rebbe answered their question. As I explained to you in one of the earlier discussions, that the Alter Rebbe would frequent the Tzemach Tzedek and learn with him after the Istalkus. The Fetter Yossi woke up in the morning. He remembered the dream, but he did not remember what the Alter Rebbe's answer was. He remembered that the Alter Rebbe came in, the Alter Rebbe answered the question, but he had no idea what the answer was. So he ran into his nephew, to the Tzemach Tzedek, to find out whether the Tzemach Tzedek had the same dream, and he had the answer. When he walked into the Tzemach Tzedek's cheder, the answer was already written on a page. He had written it up on a hanocha. He had written down what the Alter Rebbe had told him in the dream. So the Fetter Yossi sees that by his nephew and the Tzemach Tzedek, he recalled the dream, and he actually had written it down. So he says to the Tzemach Tzedek, he says, "Nu verdav zayin Rebbe." He says to his nephew, "Who's supposed to be Rebbe? You remembered the dream, and I didn't remember the dream," and so forth. This is one thing. And the other thing I wanted to mention is the following: that the Chanin of Kovner, the Chanin Spectre, the Kovner of, who was one of the greatest Goinim of Russia. He was a Litvish Goin who passed away in the 1890s. He worked closely with the Rebbe Marash and the Rebbe Rashab in the earlier years in Askandas Tiburis. He was a true Gadol B'Yisrael. And it's brought into the Shemis of Chassidim, maybe from Chitrik, that when the Mittel Rebbe was installed, he came to Lubavitch. Because the Tzemach Tzedek was a famous Gaon in Nigle. And he figured the Tzemach Tzedek, when he be a Rebbe, he'll attach himself to the Tzemach Tzedek, he'll give him a derech and limud on Nigle. But when he came to Lubavitch, he saw that this is a typical Chassidish hoif. Here there's a Maimen, here there's a Yeshivas, here there's a Fabrengen, here there's something else. So he said to himself, there's no way this man will be able to learn Torah like he did, because he's busy with all kinds of other things, and he left. After the Tzemach Tzedek's Istalkus, the Bnei Agon HaMachaber, the Tzemach Tzedek's children, published his Shas HaTshuvas Tzemach Tzedek. And when Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan saw the Tshuvas and Nigla, the Tzemach Tzedek, he commented, if I had known that it's possible for a person to do all the things that he was doing, in terms of Maimorim, and in terms of Askonis, and in terms of Yechidus, and in terms of Fabrengens, and yet to write Tshuvas like these, I would have stayed in Lubavitch. This is a story which is brought down from Chassidim. Now, as far as the Tzemach Tzedek's Nesius is concerned, Tzemach Tzedek was Rebbe for a very long time, for about 38 years, something like that. It was a very, very rich tkufa in terms of Chassidim. People say that Tzemach Tzedek had 1 million Chassidim, which means basically every other Jew in Russia was a chassid of the Tzemach Tzedek. Lubavitch peaked really by the Mittel Rebbe, by the Tzemach Tzedek, by the Rebbe Marash. It was no longer the same. But when you say that Tzemach Tzedek had 1 million Chassidim, that doesn't mean that he had 1 million visitors to Lubavitch. It means he had 1 million people who were Sorim Lamashmate, who did what he said. The arrangement in Lubavitch in those times, if you could understand it, if you could visualize it, then imagine it as Yidden lived, for many of them at least, in Shtetl, in small little villages, and they were very, very poor. They couldn't really afford to travel. Who traveled to the Rebbe, to the Tzemach Tzedek? The Rav, the Shoichet, the Mashpia, the Melamed, and the Gvir. The big Chassidim, or the well-to-do Chassidim, used to travel to Lubavitch, and many of them would bring messages from their village mates to the Rebbe, and then answers from the Rebbe to their villages. But when you say that Tzemach Tzedek had 1,000,000 Chassidim, it doesn't necessarily mean that 1,000,000 people visited Lubavitch. But the Tzemach Tzedek's reach and the Tzemach Tzedek's influence on Yiddishkeit in Russia during the duration of his long Nesius was considerable. It was a very, very powerful, powerful time. But it was a time that was saturated with tzaddis. There were so many hardships and difficulties. You had the story with the cantonisten, which was terrible. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. And then, of course, you also had the terrible, terrible problem with the Haskala, the reform that had been pushed out of Russia and Eastern Europe successfully for 2 generations. That means the times of the Alter Rebbe and the Mittel Rebbe now began to make serious inroads into Russia, using all kinds of very sinister techniques, including Mesida and going to the government and blackmail and so on. And that Tzemach Tzedek had to deal with this terrible, terrible challenge, and he fought it like a lion. And at least to some extent he was successful, at least certainly in terms of pushing off what would be the inevitable influence of the Haskala of Yidden in Russia, like I said before, as we're going to discuss later on in Mitzvah Hashem. Those are the 2 big parshas of the Tzemach Tzedek's Nesius in terms of Askanas HaKlal and Tzaddis, were the cantonistin and the Haskala. This is, of course, besides for many other decrees that came and went in Russia in those years. But before we get to that, I want to talk about something else. And that is the Tzemach Tzedek's Torah. And I want to begin with the Alter Rebbe's Maimorim. Tzemach Tzedek was the Alter Rebbe's grandson. And of course, as I explained to you in the end of last class, he was a Makabel Rishon from the Alter Rebbe. The Tzemach Tzedek did not see himself as a descendant and as an heir of the Mittel Rebbe. He saw himself as a Makabel from the Alter Rebbe. In other words, in terms of generations, the Alter Rebbe is the 1st generation, the Mittel Rebbe is the 2nd generation, and the Tzemach Tzedek is the 3rd generation. But the Tzemach Tzedek, although he's the 3rd generation, from a spiritual perspective, practically speaking, he was actually a Talmud and a Makabel from the Alter Rebbe, and he wasn't, in the words of the previous Rebbe, so Chassidik of the Mittel Rebbe. He was more connected to the Alter Rebbe. And he was incredibly dedicated to the Alter Rebbe and to the Alter Rebbe's Torah. And one of the greatest achievements of the Tzemach Tzedek's life was the gathering of the Maimorim of the Alter Rebbe. Tzemach Tzedek painstakingly and with great effort collected every Hanoch, every transcript of every Maimon of the Alter Rebbe he can get his hands on from whichever chassid he was able to. He copied them, he edited them, and he annotated them. The notes of the Tzemach Tzedek include Menachem, all kinds of source material, as well as short Hagos, commentary, asking questions, giving answers, and so forth. The Tzemach Tzedek had at his disposal 2,000 of the Maimorim of the Alter Rebbe. And he spent 32,000 hours copying, editing, and annotating the Maimorim of the Alter Rebbe. He was very, very dedicated to that end. The fact is that today, in print, we have more than 2,000 Maimorim of the Alter Rebbe. That's a fact. More than 2,000 of the Alter Rebbe. However you explain the numbers. We have a higher percentage of the Maimorim of the Alter Rebbe than of the Mittel Rebbe and of the Tzemach Tzedek. And perhaps part of the reason why a greater percentage of the Maimorim of the Alter Rebbe were preserved is because of this incredible sacrifice that Tzemach Tzedek made for their preservation. And when he finished this, which means he finished copying and editing and annotating, the Maimorim he began to publish. And from these 2,000 Maimorim he published, I don't know what number, 400 Maimorim or so, in what was meant to be a set of Svarim called Torah. Torah was meant to be 2 volumes. One volume would be Bereshis and Shmois, and then Chanukah and Purim. And the other volume would be Vayikra, B'Midbar and Dorim, and then you have Pesach and Shavuos, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot. So he completed his editing of the Maimorim of his grandfather, and then he chose what he considered the best Maimorim on Bereshis and Shmos and Chanukah and Purim, and published them in a sefer called Torah 8 and Tafkuf Talidal. That would be 1837, Tafkuf Talidal Zion. And he wrote in the introduction to that sefer that he intends on publishing a second volume, which would also be called Torah 8, which would be the Maimorim of the Alter Rebbe and Vayikra Bidva and Dvarim and so on. And then there was a Gezerah in Russia, and they shut down most of the printing houses. They left open only 2. And as a consequence of this new governmental decree, closing many of the printing houses, many of the publishing houses, the remaining printing houses of Hebrew books in Russia were so burdened with publishing the necessities like calendars and Sidurim and Chumashim and perhaps Gemaras that it was absolutely impossible to get the Torah Eir Chelik Sheni published. By the time the printing houses were reopened, the publishing houses were reopened, the Gezerah was lifted, a decade had passed. But during that decade, a number of other things occurred. Number one, it became known that the Tzemach Tzedek had notes on the whole of the Maimorim of the Alter Rebbe, and the Tzemach Tzedek's children, the people closest to him, advised him that when he prints the Torah Eir Chelik Sheni, the second volume of this set of Maimorim of the Alter Rebbe, he should include his notes, which he did not want to do. Eventually, 3 of his sons had a dream where the Alter Rebbe himself came to them and asked them to encourage their father to print his Maimorim with the Hasagis, with the Hagos of the Tzemach Tzedek. And eventually the Alter Rebbe came to the Tzemach Tzedek himself and asked him to print his Maimorim with his notes, so the Tzemach Tzedek did. And as a consequence, he changed the name from Torah Eir to Likutei Torah, and of course it's a much larger volume of Likutei Torah, but Vayikra Bidva Dvarim, and then you have Pesach, Shavuos, Hashanah, Kippur, and Sukkot, and you also have on the back Shir HaShirim. And of course it's a larger volume because there's more Maimorim, but it's also a larger volume because it's including the Tzemach Tzedek's Hagos. So Tzemach Tzedek had an enormous investment in the Maimorim of the Alter Rebbe. And he wrote notes either on a very great number of them or on all of them. What is true is that there were fires in Lubavitch. There were several very large fires in Lubavitch. And during a number of these fires, huge quantities of the Tzemach Tzedek's Kavim were destroyed. And the Tzemach Tzedek, of course, complained how it would be impossible for him to rewrite them. We do not have all the Tzemach Tzedek's Hagos on the Maimorim of the Alter Rebbe. We have only a percentage. But the Tzemach Tzedek wrote, like I said to you before, either on all of them or on a very, very large number. And many of them were lost. There's actually a story about the Rav of Lubavitch who was given Ksovim with the Tzemach Tzedek to watch, and when the fire broke out, he saved his pillows and his blankets, and the Ksovim were destroyed. Tzemach Tzedek was so upset because the Tzemach Tzedek said he'll never have the time to rewrite them. In addition, we also know that the Tzemach Tzedek wrote a Schum Adir, an incredible volume of Ksovim of his own Chassidus, also a considerable portion of which has been destroyed in fires. And the Tzemach Tzedek's style of writing Chassidus has 2 basic forms. One is that he would actually write out Maimorim in longhand, which is what we are familiar with, like the Mendel Rebbe did, like the Rebbe Maharash did, just actually writing out the whole Maimon as one would say it. And the other is the yeshivas. Tzemach Tzedek used to write these little notes, cliff notes. They can be 5 lines or 10 lines, and you can have 20, 30, 40 sources from Medrashim and from Zayir and from Kabbalah and from Chassidus. And these were very, very, very brief notes of a Maimer, which he sometimes said and sometimes didn't say. And there are thousands of such little Rishimalach notes. Some of them are shorter, some of them are longer, where the Tzemach Tzedek would write, in effect, the essence, the gist, the tamtzis, the summary of a Maimer in shorthand, in notes. And frequently these notes were never flushed out. The Tzemach Tzedek never said them. The Rebbe Maharash never wrote them down, and they remain by us in the Eira Teira as we have it now. Pardon me. These little notes, and sometimes you can have from the Rebbe a whole Maimer based on a few lines of these Rishimas from the Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek. In other words, the Tzemach Tzedek wrote notes to account for hundreds, possibly thousands of Maimorim that he wrote in very, very brief form. A considerable number of them he also said. But obviously when he said them in longhand, and when he wrote them in shorthand. And then quite a number of them he never said altogether, he just wrote Rishimas. I've explained to you on a number of occasions in the past that my Mori Chasidus Chabad, B'derech Klal, are the Alter Rebbes. My Mori Chasidus Alter Rebbes. There are many Rishimas in the Tzemach Tzedek which are original. The Mori the Rebbe said, for example, from the Tzemach Tzedek, which cannot be traced back to the Alter Rebbe, to the Tzemach Tzedek's original. Tzemach Tzedek did write my Morim, or at least cliff notes, Nekudes, which were meant to be the basis for my Morim, which at least in Das Tachten, on the surface, do not have a root in the Maimorim of the Alter Rebbe that we have, that it's Tzemach Tzedek's original Maimorim. So we have in print today, I don't know, close to 40 volumes of Eira Torah, which is the Tzemach Tzedek's Chasidus. In it, some are long Maimorim, written out completely from beginning to end. And the assumption is that those Maimorim were written during the earlier years of his Rebbisteve, of his 10 years at Rebbe, maybe even before. And many, many Rishimas, these short abbreviated notes, which are not necessarily written out. A significant percentage of the Eira Torah is the Maimorim of the Alter Rebbe with the Tzemach Tzedek's notes on them. Some of the Maimorim of the Alter Rebbe appear first in the Eira Torah, in the Tzemach Tzedek's Chassidus, and only afterwards were they printed over in the Maimorim of the Alter Rebbe. And from what I understand, and I am not an expert, from what I understand, as much Chassidus as we have from the Tzemach Tzedek, it's only a percentage of what he wrote. He wrote actually much, much more. In addition to all of this, Tzemach Tzedek wrote a Gevald mit Nigle, an unbelievable volume of Nigle. The previous Rebbe describes single essays of the Tzemach Tzedek, hundreds of pages long, on one topic in Nigle. The previous Rebbe says that during the Tzemach Tzedek's lifetime, he wrote 60,000 boigin. 60,000 boigin. A boigin, I don't know what it means technically, but it's 8 sides, 8 sheets of paper. In other words, 60,000 times 8 is close to 500,000 sheets of paper. Think about written in how much Torah that is. It's an extraordinary amount, and we have much, much less than 500,000 sheets of paper, than 60,000 boigin for the Tzemach Tzedek, which means that a majority, maybe a vast majority, are lost in one way or another. This included, of course, Niglan, included Chasidus, and included Chuvas, but he wrote an enormous amount of Torah. Tzemach Tzedek was a masmid otzum. His diligence was indescribable. He was masmid alaki. And his Kerech HaChiddush was unbelievable. And he was obsessed with Torah, mamish obsessed with Torah. Tzemach Tzedek always complained that people should leave him alone because he wanted to learn. I think I read this someplace, but if I didn't read it, I heard it from somebody, that in every ledge, in every shelf of the Tzemach Tzedek house, there was paper and a pen and ink. Because ideas would come to him as he was walking from one room to the next. He would stop and write Chiddushei Torah. He was constantly writing Chiddushei Torah. He wrote an incredible volume of Chiddushei Torah. The Rebbe once mentioned in a Fabrengen, a very interesting thing, that it says in the Megillah Esther, that Vayikoru Seifrei HaMelech Va'eis Hahi B'Chedesh Arishan Hu Chedesh Nisan B'Shleisha Asa Yom Bei. It says in the Megillah that the first decree of Achashverosh was written. They called the scribes of the king in the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 13th day of the month. So the Rebbe said that Hamelech goes on the Yebishter, and Seifrei HaMelech goes on the Tzemach Tzedek, and the Yosef Karu, the base Yosef, who both Yortzeit is the Gimel Nisan. They share the same Yortzeit. And the Rebbe said that this is a remes, that the Pasuk in Tanakh, and Megillah Esther hints that Seifrei HaMelech, the Gedolei Yisrael, who wrote maximum Chiddushei Torah, the Haskala at the same Yortzeit, the Haskala is in Gimel Nisan. This is the extent to which the Tzemach Tzedek wrote and left us an incredible kamos, incredible volume of Chiddushei Torah. And of course, there are interesting stories that the Tzemach Tzedek complained. How come the Chassidim are bothering him as a Rebbe? That he wants to learn and he wants to daven, and people are coming to him and they're asking him questions. So there's a number of different stories regarding this. And one of them is that the Marash was in his room, and I think it was Shavuos time, and the Chassidim were coming to Lubavitch in droves and hordes. And the Tzemach Tzedek said, "Was willen sie von mir?" And so the Marash told him they're coming to the Rebbe to hear Torah and so on. So he complained, "Why are they coming to me? Torah belongs to the Eibishter, and they should leave me alone." So the Rebbe Marash went over to the bookcase. There were shelves that were covered by a curtain. They pulled back the curtain, and in the shelf you had hundreds of notebooks of Tzemach Tzedek's own Chiddushei Torah. And the Rebbe Marash said to his father, to the Rebbe Tzemach Tzedek, it was a question. If not for them, would you have all of this? In other words, the Tzemach Tzedek's incredible volume, Kamos, of Torah was directly connected to the fact that he was a Rebbe over Chassidim, and he had a chance to write this all down, and that eventually the Eibusher would help, at least a percentage of it would be published in our generation, and so forth. So this is just a little insight into the Tzemach Tzedek's Koch and Torah. Another interesting thing is that, of course, that Tzemach Tzedek was very different than his father-in-law, than the Mittler Rebbe, the second Rebbe of Chabad. The Mittler Rebbe, first of all, used to take a maimer from the Alter Rebbe and put his notes into the maimer in such a way that von a Wort is geworden a Quart. Which means the Alter Rebbe could say a maimer for 15 minutes, the Mittler Rebbe could make it into 5 hours. Because he would write down the Alter Rebbe's words, but insert into the text his commentary on the maimer. And we've had conversations about this earlier, that the Alter Rebbe gave the Mittler Rebbe permission to do this, although his other transcribers, the other Menachem, he told them they have to write his words precisely without adding anything. But the Mittler Rebbe, the Alter Rebbe was in very high esteem of the Mittler Rebbe, and he actually encouraged the Mittler Rebbe to write Hanochas, to write transcripts of the Maimorim of the Alter Rebbe with his own notes. So many of the Maimorim that we have today, either from the Alter Rebbe or the Mittler Rebbe, were not written during the years that the Mittler Rebbe was a Rebbe, they were written during the years that the Alter Rebbe was a Rebbe. Because the Mittler Rebbe, even then, used to write his father's Maimorim with huge arichis, with huge commentary, huge elaboration, and the Alter Rebbe encouraged it, and the Alter Rebbe supported it. So the Friedrich Rebbe writes about the Mittler Rebbe's Maimorim, as men can sail in the Asias Haravi pedal, that even though he elaborates so much on the Chassidus of his father, the Alter Rebbe, you can count the original words of the Alter Rebbe in the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer like pearls. In other words, he's preserving Lashon Harav. But the Tzemach Tzedek had an issue with this. Tzemach Tzedek disagreed with his father-in-law and his predecessor, the Mittler Rebbe. The Tzemach Tzedek held that because the Mittler Rebbe is writing such a long commentary, long explanation of the Maram of the Alter Rebbe, the original wording of the Alter Rebbe is lost. So he therefore took a different sheet, he took a different approach, where instead of writing in longhand his commentary on the Maram of the Alter Rebbe, he would leave the Maram of the Alter Rebbe as they were. He'd create parentheses, and inside the parentheses he would write short notes with sources and very, very brief comments that need to be flushed out, that need to be developed, because he felt that if he's going to write in a much more concise, in a much more abbreviated way, people will be able to identify what's the maimer of the Alter Rebbe's and what's his addition, because to him that was very important to preserve the Lashon Harav of the Alter Rebbe. So in this way he was very, very different than his father-in-law, the Mittler Rebbe. And again, I'm not an expert, but from the few cases where I have seen, sometimes the Mittler Rebbe and the Tzemach Tzedek say exactly the same thing. They're both making commentary on the maimer of the Alter Rebbe, but the Mittler Rebbe does it over the course of 4 pages. Tzemach Tzedek does it over the course of 5 lines, because the Mittler Rebbe writes it out like it's his own maimer, and the Tzemach Tzedek leaves it in the form of a note, or a hagah, or a hasage, that you should see clearly what's the Alter Rebbe's and what's the Rebbe of the Tzemach Tzedek. That's number 1. And of course, number 2, the style of Amiras Chassidus was very different. By the Mittler Rebbe, particularly in the later years, the recitation of Chassidus was on Ashir, on Abreg. You would say Chassidus non-stop, for hours and hours and hours. When the Tzemach Tzedek became a Rebbe, he started to be much more mitzumtzum in Zman, much more controlled in the time that he dedicated to say Memori Chassidus. It was on a schedule. It didn't happen as in the middle of the night. We would send to call Chassidim for a Maimer. There was a schedule, and the Maimerim were much shorter. And at the beginning, the Chassidim of the Mittler Rebbe, who went over to the Tzemach Tzedek, had a very big problem with this transition. They were so used to a flood of Chassidus. All of a sudden, the Chassidus is so betzimtzum, and they complained to the Tzemach Tzedek about this. So one of the ideas which is brought down from Chassidim, so that the Tzemach Tzedek said in response to this complaint, is that you cannot compare me to my shver, to the Mittler Rebbe. The Mittler Rebbe had built in Lubavitch a gigantic shul. It was called the Hoidu Aleinu Shul. The shul was so large you could walk from one end to the other and say the whole davening, Hoidu Aleinu Shul. So the Tzemach Tzedek says, my shver, the Mittler Rebbe, could walk from one end of the shul to the other end of the shul and learn through a half a shas. he could go from the second end to the first end and learn this other half of the Shas. Ich darf noch lernen Nigla. Tzemach Tzedek said, I'm still busy, I have to learn Nigla. But the fact is that by the Tzemach Tzedek, the Chassidus was much more mugbul, much more limited, much more orderly in time, and very different than what the Chassidim had gotten used to at the end of the years of the Mittler Rebbe. Now, before we move on to the next topic, I just want to say one more story, which is brought by the Rebbe Rashab. The Rebbe Rashab was all of 5.5 when the Rebbe Tzemach Tzedek was nostalgic. He was very young. And he was once by his grandfather, and the Chassidim were coming. So the Tzemach Tzedek said to his grandson, the Rebbe Rashab, "Was willen sie von mir? What do the Chassidim want from me? Why are they bothering me?" So the Rebbe Rashab said, they came to here to learn Torah. So the Tzemach Tzedek said to his young grandson, the Torah doch nicht meine, the Torah dem Eibishten's. Torah is not mine, Torah belongs to the Eibishter. Why are they coming to me? So the young Rebbe Rashab said to the Tzemach Tzedek, Zeide, Zoga du hast nicht kein Torah, weil sie von dir antleifen. Zeide, tell them you have no Torah, they'll run away from you, which is a way of telling Tzemach Tzedek, who are we kidding? Of course, you have Torah, and of course you will share the Torah. So this is a little bit about the Tzemach Tzedek's writings, and his Chassidus. There's obviously much more to say, but this is a little bit about it. Now, I want to talk about the cantonisten, the Gazette of the cantonisten, the cantonists, at least in brief. In the Sefer Migdal, he talks about the Mittler Rebbe, how the Mittler Rebbe saw the Alter Rebbe a number of times, and the Alter Rebbe told him that there was going to be a gzeira of taking little children into the army for a long period of time. And the way it was, they would take them away from home when they were 8, 9, and 10. They would spend a very, very long time in growing up, and then they had to spend maybe a quarter century beyond that in the service of the country. It was a very, very cruel decree, which basically made them soldiers for half their lives. And it was specifically directed at the Jewish people. And it was a gezerah from Nikolai, from Nicholas Yimach Shmei, who was a very, very big Rasha. And his motivation was a hope that Rahman al-San of Upshmaden, he will forcibly convert to Christianity all of these Jewish soldiers. So the Mittler Rebbe said, Ich ken das nicht. The Mittler Rebbe said, I can't handle this. And the story is that he went to Nezhin, to Hadich, to his father's tzien in Gadich, the Alter Rebbe. And he came out and he said, the Tat hat mir abgesagt von der Rabbanis, my father freed me from the Rabbanis. Chassidim did not understand what it meant, but on his 54th birthday, test kiss of Tov Kuf Peches, the Mittler Rebbe was nostalgic. The Mittler Rebbe had time, before he passed away, to say a maimah, which is now in print, Lahavin inyan lekichas anshe chayil b'bnei Yisrael, to explain the Chassidus, the Kabbalah, of the idea of Yiddish kinderlach, Jewish children being taken into forcible draft and spending decades in the Russian army. So this parsha of the cantonisten was left in effect to the Tzemach Tzedek. The Tzemach Tzedek had to deal with the gezerah of the cantonisten. And of course, there's a lot of aspects to the parsha. One of them is that every community had to give a certain number of children. And immediately started the corruption, that the parents of rich children would give a bribe that their children should not be included in the lottery, and things of this sort. On the other hand, Ehrliche people didn't want to draw any separations. All children should be equally exposed to this lottery, to have to serve, and so forth. And there were also, as a consequence of this, very, very undesirable aspects where children would be kidnapped by people that were called chappers. They were Jews. And these children were sent off to serve in the Russian army. And the way I understand it was, this was a way of saving other children from having to serve in the army. So it was a terrible, terrible decree which brought the worst out of many, many Jewish people. It was a terrible, terrible decree. And the Tzemach Tzedek, of course, had to deal with this. First of all, the Tzemach Tzedek had what was called the Chevra Tchias HaMesim. The Chevra Tchias HaMesim, their job was to recapture the children who had been drafted and bring them back to Yiddishkeit. And of course, one of the obvious ways to do this was to announce that the children died, and they would put up duds, fake matzeves, if the children had died, and the children could not go back to their families. They'd have to go someplace else in Russia where they could live as Jewish children. The Russian government, of course, eventually caught on, and they would dig up, they would exhume these graves and see that they were empty. So they would have to, when a Jewish child would actually die, they would put up the matzeva of a cantonist and so on. There were all kinds of games that were played. And there was a lot of mesiras nefesh on the part of a lot of people to help the Tzemach Tzedek save a lot of children. And like I said before, there were the chapers who were capturing, kidnapping Jewish children. And there were the chervet chiyas hamesim who were saving them, who were sparing them, who were getting them out. And of course, we all know the famous stories that the Tzemach Tzedek was very makar of the cantonists. The Tzemach Tzedek said about the cantonisten, as they will alle starben by the tshuva, they'll all die by the tshuva. And there are incredible stories about the cantonisten and their mesiras nefesh. One of the stories which is brought in the Sikhe is as follows. Officially, the Russian government did not prevent them from practicing their religion. Officially, they were allowed to be Yidden. But they took them at a very early age, and they hoped that they would forget. They would try to force them to eat non-kosher food, and they had to resist, and there would be beatings, and there would be intimidations, and so on. But when the Jewish soldiers requested religious services, the government of Russia officially had to provide it. And if the Tzemach Tzedek was ever around where there were Jewish soldiers, he would make every opportunity possible to go and meet them and to speak to them. In fact, there is one single maimer from the Tzemach Tzedek which is written in Yiddish. Tzemach Tzedek's maimerim are written all in Hebrew. There's one maimer of the Tzemach Tzedek which is written in Yiddish. The maimer begins Shema Yisrael, and it's a maimer that Tzemach Tzedek said to a group of cantonists. And like I said, there's a couple of very famous stories about the cantonisten. And one of them is that the Tzemach Tzedek was invited by a group of soldiers to come and speak to them. And he came to them and he spoke to them and he verbringt with them. And then he said that if anybody tells you, Rachmana litzlan, to be meimedas, to give up your faith, and to become, God forbid, a goy, even if it's the king of Russia himself, you should tell them that the Lubavitch Rebbe was here, and the Lubavitch Rebbe said that even if the king of Russia will tell us to convert, we shouldn't. And then a few months after that, there was an occasion where the Caesar, with the Tsar of Russia, came to watch soldiers doing maneuvers, a performance. And they did very, very, very well. But there was something that bothered the king very, very much, because he heard their names. They were all Yiddish names, Berel, Chaim, Moshe, and so on. And the case had asked, who are these soldiers? And he was told this is a group of cantonists that were exceptional in their service. So the Tsar said that if they will agree to convert to Christianity, he will make them the king's the personal guard of the king, which was considered the highest honor. And the way the story goes is they told him that a while back the Lubavitch Rebbe was here, and the Lubavitch Rebbe told us that even if the king of Russia himself will call us to convert, we shouldn't listen to him. And there was, I think there were 300 of them, and they jumped into the river and drowned themselves, rather than convert Rahman al-Islam to Natzus, to Christianity. And there are many such stories of the heroism and the mesiras nefesh of the cantonisten. They were very, very simple Jews. They were soldiers, so their entire education was in soldiery, and they served long, long terms of duty. And when they would finish their service, many of them would return to Yiddishkeit and to their families. They were allowed to build communities outside the Pale of Settlements. They were allowed to live any place in Russia. And the cantonists, as a consequence, had their own little communities and their own shuls and their own very, very unique type of Yiddishkeit, which reflected their having been soldiers. There's a story which happened much, much later, but it's just a good story to tell, that there was a community of cantonists and they had a rov, and it came Rosh Hashanah, and they all came to shul, and they were not behaving properly. They were making noise, they were talking. So the Rav got up on the bimah, and he banged, he says, tomorrow everybody's going to come to shul in their uniform with all their medals, like soldiers. And they came to shul the following day with their uniforms and all their medals, and they stood like soldiers, and they davened to the Eibishter with the full awe, with the full respect, as soldiers of the Tsar. Then there's another story, also an amazing story about the cantonisten, that there was a shul of cantonisten that did not have a chazan. And they were themselves. So when it came to Ne'ilah, there became a big question: who should be the Baal Tefillah? Who should lead the davening of this whole group of cantonisten? And it came down to whichever one of them got the most beatings. So they identified one of them who had terrible, terrible scars all over his back from the beatings he had taken because of his defiance, because of his refusal to give up Yiddishkeit and so forth. And they elected him to be the Chazan for Ne'ilah. So he said, if I'm going to be Chazan because of the scars, he took off his shirt and he stood by the Yomid that the Eibusher should see all the scars that he had gotten as a cantonist. The next thing I want to explore is the Haskala. The efforts of the Haskala movement, what we call today the Reform movement, to make inroads into Russia. I want to preface by saying something else. But I'm going to be very candid and admit that I think this is true. This is what I sort of surmise from what I've read and what I understand. But maybe I'm simplifying it just a little bit. During the Nesias of the Mittler Rebbe, during the leadership of the Mittler Rebbe, Chabad Hasidus achieved an enormous amount of form. Tzir, Metzias. What that means, in other words, is this. Hasidus is a very deep way of serving Hashem. It's a pneumistic way of serving Hashem. In other words, in Hasidus, one of the key ideas of all of Chassidus is the Ein of Midas HaEmes. Everything has to be true. And as a consequence, substance matters and form doesn't matter. But the Alter Rebbe nevertheless wanted that the form should also be beautiful, not at the expense of the substance, but as an expression of the substance, as a decoration for the substance, and so on. The way you saw this by the Alter Rebbe was in the Negina. The Alter Rebbe was very into music, Negina. It says a Lashon Sichas, the Alter Rebbe hat ausgeführt, hat gewollt und hat ausgeführt bei Chassidim in a Negina. The Alter Rebbe wanted Chassidim to sing. And the Negina of the Chassidim, of course, was exceptional. The Negurim Chabad that we have, and we have only a percentage of the Negurim that used to exist, are the best Negurim. They're just amazing Negurim. And it was something that was very important to the Alter Rebbe that Chassidus should have a yofi, a beauty. By the Mittler Rebbe, this beauty went on to another level. The Alter Rebbe, Mittler Rebbe had a choir and an orchestra. That means Kli Zemer, Bekelim, and Beshir, Bepeh. He had a whole group of people who played musical instruments and chazanim who sang, who would perform and compose negunim to create a beauty and a grandeur about the negin of Chassidus Chabad. He also had a stable of horses. We've talked about this at different times. When the Tzemach Tzedek became Rebbe, a lot of these things were discontinued. And the way I understand it, the reason these things were discontinued was because they were worried about Eina Pekicha or Eina Bisha. The government of Russia was paying attention to Lubavitch. And Lubavitch had become a metropolis. Lubavitch had become a huge malucha, kingship. And the government of Russia was meddling. When the Mittler Rebbe passed away, they were in his hair, they were bothering him about his finances. And I'm not certain if those issues were ever fully resolved. In other words, some people say that the Mittler Rebbe's case ended because the Mittler Rebbe passed away, or immediately prior to the Mittler Rebbe's histalkos, or immediately after the Mittler Rebbe's histalkos. And it was sort of decided that Chabad should be a little bit more low-key. There should be less of the tumult, less of the shturim, less of the chitzonius that used to exist. They stopped with the orchestra, they stopped with the choir, they stopped with a lot of things. Amongst the things that the Tzemach Tzedek stopped was, first of all, there was a niggin that Chassidim used to sing, Baruch Hu Elokeinu. The words exist. I think I saw it in Kerem Chabad once. Baruch Hu Elokeinu was a niggin with many words that thanks Hashem for the fact that the Chassidim are not misnagdim. It was an important niggin the Chassidim used to sing in those days. Thank God we're Chassidim. And this was one of the Negurim Chassidim used to sing. And apparently, at one point in the Tzemach Tzedek's Nesias, the Tzemach Tzedek allowed people to know that he wanted this niggin to be discontinued. They stopped singing it, and they stopped singing it to such a degree that now the niggin is lost. Another thing which apparently was stopped during the Nesias of the Tzemach Tzedek, which is also a similar idea to diminish the showiness of Chassidus, was something called the Yechidus Tanz. A yeshivas tanz, which was very important in the times of the Alter Rebbe and the Middle Rebbe and the beginning of Tzemach Tzedek's years, basically meant as follows. If you went into yeshivas to the Rebbe that night, so the Seder was, when you come out of yeshivas, you would dance. The first thing you did was dance. The second thing you did, of course, was sit down and be mizboinen, contemplate the yeshivas, and then, of course, write it down. But the first thing you did was join a dance. And the Seder, the yeshivas tanz was that the only people who would dance would be the people who went into yeshivas that night. Everybody else would stand around and clap. And there's, of course, some very interesting stories about interesting characters who ended up at these yeshivas tanzen and were hoping to get away before people would discover who they were, and so forth and so on. But these were examples of things that were discontinued because of the Eina Bisha, because of the eyes of the government that were on Lubavitch, and so forth and so on. So with this little bit of background, let's go on to the Haskala, to the Reform. The Reform were, of course, Jews who thought they were doing the world a favor by modernizing the Jewish people. They had this idea that if Jews would be more like the Goy, Rahman al-Itzlan, so there'd be less anti-Semitism. And of course, the schar for this incredible effort were the Nazis, who started in the same place where this idea began. And as a consequence, the Reform were not happy to be reformers themselves. They wanted everybody else to be reformers. They also considered themselves intellectuals and scholars and academics. And they had this idea that the Jews need to be more intellectual. But of course, the neshama was lost. They tried in Western Europe. They had great success in Germany and in England and in France. But when they made efforts to come into Eastern Europe and to Russia, they were immediately stopped by Chassidim, by the Alter Rebbe, by the Alter Rebbe's contemporaries, and they realized that they didn't stand a chance. In the times of the Tzemach Tzedek, they started again making huge efforts to see if they could push their agenda. And to be candid, they were quite militant. If need be, they could be violent also. And they also used the government. They went to the government and they mastered that the Jewish people are educating their children correctly, and therefore they're not making a living properly, and therefore it's costing the Russian government money, and there should be efforts made to force the Russian government into changing things about Yiddishkeit, and particularly to change things about Inyan HaChinuch. And the Tzemach Tzedek went on Mesiras Nefesh for this. The Tzemach Tzedek would not give an inch. When it came to this question of chinuch, of Yiddish kinder, and not compromising on the Chassidish and the Yiddish values which Jewish people had mikad mazdana from time immemorial, the Tzemach Tzedek wouldn't budge an inch. In other words, he wouldn't compromise an iota. He wouldn't compromise one drop. And of course, the way you need to understand this is as follows. The inventors of education are Jews. The very idea of teaching children as children, so they should grow up as adults to be successful adults, is a Jewish idea. The initiator, the founder of the concept of chinuch was a Yid by the name of Avraham Avinu. And the Torah says, it says in Chumash, Ki yedaitiv leman asher yitzave es bonav es beisei acharav v'shomru derech havaya laset stokol mishpat. The reason the Eibishter loved and favored Avraham Avinu above and beyond who he was asher yitzave es bonav es beisei. He was going to teach his children to be like him. So Jews have been educating their children forever. And we don't need anybody to help us with how we're supposed to raise children. We don't need any eitzes from anybody about what chinuch is. And of course, Yiddish chinuch does not only consist of data, of information, of having knowledge and understanding and so on and so forth. It consists very, very much of emunah, faith in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and also of values, kindness, goodness, honesty, and so on. And the traditional methods of chinuch, which everybody went to cheder, and then a dardiki malamed, and then one malamed, and a second malamed, and so on and so forth, were all meant to bring about that end, that Yiddish kinder should grow up to be what we called erliche Yidden, good Jews, sincere Jews, honorable Jews, respectable Jews, and respectful Jews, based on the principles of Torah and Yiddishkeit. And the idea that some kind of modern attitudes of pedagogy and new philosophies in education, which had to do with academics, that were even slightly separated from the tradition, where the spirit of Yiddishkeit, which is Emunah and Midas Tevis, would be distanced from the academic achievement and academic excellence, the academic success, was something that Tzemach Tzedek would not suffer. And he went to war for this. Now the Haskala was very, very sly and shrewd and sinister. They came into Russia, they started these schools, and then they invited Jewish children to join, and then they tried to get the government of Russia to force a certain percentage of Jewish children to learn in these schools. If I'm not wrong, the Tzemach Tzedek himself had 2 of his Einiklach learn in one of these schools because of one of these Gzeiris, and the Tzemach Tzedek gave special attention to these 2 grandchildren because they were being forced to involve themselves in something which was totally against the wishes of the Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek. And they were very, very deliberate in how they hoped to make inroads into Russia. And one of the things they did was they sent a spy to Lubavitch, at least one, maybe more. And this spy grew a beard. He looked like a chassid. Of course, he knew how to learn, and he could play the part well, and he hung around Lubavitch for a long time. And his purpose was to figure out what place the Tzemach Tzedek plays in the Russian Jewry, and how best to placate the Tzemach Tzedek so they should be able to do their evil deeds, what they wish to do. And there's all kinds of details of descriptions of this period of this spy spending time in Lubavitch. But the conclusion that he drew after spending a few months in Lubavitch is the following. Tzemach Tzedek is a great scholar, he's a holy man, very, very well respected. But he's a batlin. He doesn't really know what's going on. And if the Haskala could figure out how to respect him, and not to step on his toes, not to upset him, not to upset his ego, we can do whatever we want because he doesn't know what's going on. And it's brought down that while the Haskala was writing these words, the Tzemach Tzedek had an entire underground network of Rabbanim and Gedolei Yisrael, people like Rabbi Isaac Homler and others, who were making great efforts at undermining their efforts. And they had absolutely no idea. They were convinced that Tzemach Tzedek doesn't know what's going on, because this was the Tzemach Tzedek's approach, that he would give the appearance of being unaware, of being naive, when in reality he was incredibly sharp and incredibly aware and incredibly involved and so forth and so on. There's actually a story with the Rebbe, with our Rebbe, that the Geshem went to Russia, Geshem Jacobson went to Russia, and they talked to the Chassidim in Russia about the Rebbe. So the Chassidim in Russia said, if the Rebbe cares so much about us, how come we don't see it? So when he told us back to the Rebbe told him the story I just told you, and he concluded with the words, Nit val mezet nicht is a simin am tut nicht. The fact that you don't see what I'm doing doesn't mean I'm not doing anything. I may be doing an awful lot. And this was the Tzemach Tzedek's approach. And of course, this involved all kinds of things. They wanted to change the books out of which Yiddish Kinderlach learned, to make abbreviated chumashim, where they would skip what they considered inappropriate material for children, where they would focus on Hebrew grammar and Hebrew language and so on. And the Tzemach Tzedek's approach was Al tigu b'mshicha v'vi al tereu elu tenikah shavitz rabba, and if it has to do with Jewish children, mix out. Nothing at all can be touched whatsoever. And you can make the case that some of the ideas may have been academically good, but a Yiddish child is not raised on intellectual aptitude and excellence. Only a Yiddish child is raised on the values of Amun and Midas and so on. And therefore the Tzemach Tzedek said they have no business at all. And it all culminated in a very famous meeting that took place near Tafresh Gimel. That means 1843, where the Tzemach Tzedek was invited as a guest of the Russian government to come to Petersburg, which was the capital, together with several other people, to convene a commission that would together determine the future of education of Jewish children in Russia. There were 5 members on the commission. There was one chassid, that was the Tzemach Tzedek. There was one misnagid, this was a Yid by the name of Ichel of Volozhiner, who was a Talmud of Reb Chaim Volozhiner. Probably was a son of Reb Chaim Volozhiner. The Rebbe once mentioned that Reb Chaim Volozhiner met the Mittler Rebbe, and they related to each other favorably. This was the son of Reb Chaim Volozhiner, Ichel of Volozhiner. There was somebody who represented the business committee whose name was Halperin. I don't know his first name at the moment. And then, of course, there was Betal Steren, who represented the reform. He was a reformer. He was a very intelligent man, very modern man. He may have been frum to some degree in his own personal life, but he was an intellectual, and he really had huge issues with Jewish religion and faith and so on. But as a human being, he was very, very intelligent and very, very refined. And even though he and the Tzemach Tzedek disagreed on everything, on a personal level, on a human level, a like actually developed between these two men, which became of use, as you'll see momentarily. And of course, the fifth member of the meeting was a representative of the Russian government, who was a Russian guy whose name is also brought, I don't remember. And the five of them convened in Petersburg for about 3 months to discuss the future of Jewish education of Yidden in Russia. So we know from the Siches that the previous Rebbe writes that the Tzemach Tzedek asked his children to say the whole Tillim for many days, and so on. When he went to Petersburg, he took along with him tachrichim, shrouds, which are the clothing with which a person is buried. And when one of his children said to him, Tate, du schreckst the Mame, Father, you're frightening our mother by acting in such a reckless way, acting in such a way, that Tzemach Tzedek said, Gut, ich will sie soll sich schrecken, I would rather that she be afraid, I want her to be afraid. Soll sie von mir mispal sein, I want her to daven for me. Quote, sie ist die richtige Bas Talmud Chacham, she's the true daughter of a Talmud Chacham. And he went off to this meeting and he spent 3 months there. And during those 3 months, what would happen on a typical day was that Halperin would abstain. The businessman would keep quiet. I don't know how religious or secular he was, but he certainly didn't need any trouble. And therefore, when the minister and Betzal Shteren voted one way, and the Tzemach Tzedek and the Ichel of Volozhny voted another way, and he abstained, so it became a tie. And according to the rules of this discussion that had been established at the outset, when there was a tie, the Russian representative got a second vote, which automatically made it 3-2. This made this 3-month period very, very difficult. Tzemach Tzedek was fighting an uphill battle because he didn't have the vote, so to speak. And it was Meisa Nefesh not to abandon even the smallest aspects of Yiddishkeit. I don't know how this Mesiras Nefesh expressed itself practically, but this we do know, that during the 3 months that he was there, he was 22 times arrested. He was 22 times put under house arrest. Now that doesn't sound like anything, but in reality it was very dangerous. In other words, when Tzemach Tzedek took along Tachrichim, there was a legitimate justification. He was risking his life because he had no intentions in making any compromise whatsoever in the area of Yiddish Chinuch. When he went to that meeting, he took along his son, the Maril. The second of his sons was Rabbi Lev the Maril, the most famous of his children during his lifetime. The Maril was a Tzemach Tzedek's son, but he was old enough to have been a makabel from the Mittler Rebbe. He was very close to the Mittler Rebbe. To such an extent that when his father became Rebbe, he did not become his father's chassid, he remained loyal to his grandfather. But during the 3 months that he spent with his father in Petersburg, he saw the recklessness with which the Tzemach Tzedek threw away his own life. He didn't at all think about himself. He just thought about the Indian. He was so unbelievably impressed, he was so moved, that when they came back from Petersburg at the end of those 3 months, he came back a chassid of his father. And as the story is brought, the Tzemach Tzedek said to the Rebbe and Chaya Mushke, das stellen a speziellen Warmes, make a special dinner. Ich habe gebracht von Petersburg a frischer chassid. I brought from Petersburg a new chassid. And whom did he mean? He meant his own son, the Maharil, who witnessed all of this. Now here's a story that I made reference to before. The Tzemach Tzedek was a guest of the government, which meant that the government provided for him accommodations. They gave him a place to stay, and I suppose somehow they paid for whatever costs he would encounter during the trip, and things like this. And the actual meetings took place in another part of the city. In order to go from his lodging to the place where the meetings took place, he had to walk through a park. The park was a private park that belonged to the government, and you're only allowed in with a special pass. And of course, as an official guest of the government of Russia, the Tzemach Tzedek had such a pass. He came along with an entourage. He had his son with him and a couple of chassidim with him. And he never walked through the park. He would always walk around, always circumvented. He didn't want to walk through it. One day, there was an issue that was raised. There were many issues raised. And the issue that was raised was Kabbalah. And the reformers wanted to impress on the government of Russia that they outlaw the study of Kabbalah altogether. They should not allow the publishing of Kabbalah literature, they should outlaw the learning of it, and so on. And the Tzemach Tzedek fought tooth and nail against this, obviously. And as could be predicted, the Tzemach Tzedek and Ichel of Volozhny were on one side, the Halper and the businessmen said nothing, and Betzalel Stedin and the reform and the government agent on the other side, so it was 3 against 2. At a certain point during that day, they took a recess, they stopped. And the Tzemach Tzedek went back to his hotel. At the end of the recess, the Tzemach Tzedek went back for the next session, and he made a rare exception. Instead of walking around the park, as was his tradition, he walked straight through the park. And he walked in the middle of the park, and he came to a bench, and sitting on the bench was this Betzalel Stedin, the reformer, very, very deep in thought. And like I said to you before, he was a very refined intellectual, and therefore on a personal level, he and Tzemach Tzedek got along quite well. There were some of the reformers who were very famous, that were corrupt, that were immoral. The one who founded the reform in Cincinnati, it says in the Tzemach Tzedek, in Tuas Haskala from the previous Rebbe, that he was accused of all kinds of corruption, of all kinds of low, immoral crimes, and he ran away from Russia and settled in Cincinnati and started the reform in America. So he was obviously not such a refined person. But the Betzalel Stedin was an edel mensch and a big cup mensch, and he was sitting on this bench deeply engrossed in thought. In other words, he was taken by the Tzemach Tzedek, he was taken by the debate and the conversation, and he was completely consumed by it. And he was sitting tief atracht. Tzemach Tzedek walked up to him, and I assume he saw the Tzemach Tzedek, and the Tzemach Tzedek started to cry. And Tzemach Tzedek told him that the Gemara says, Bocha Rabbi v'yomer, yesh keinei lomei v'shah achas. That the Gemara says that Rabbeinu HaKadosh cried for whatever reason. And he said that it's possible for a person to acquire his Elam Haba in 1 hour. And the Tzemach Tzedek said this Gemara to his Betzalel Stedin, and then he finished and said, Shtim mit uns. On the question of Kabbalah, vote with us. That was the only issue. In other words, he didn't assert himself on Betzalel Stedin, but in this case he did. When it came to the idea that the government of Russia wanted to outlaw the study of Kabbalah, Tzemach Tzedek walked into the park and asked Betzalel Stedin to change his vote, and he did. And as a consequence, this question of Kabbalah was taken off the table, and I assume that means that Betzalel Stedin, but that Tzemach Tzedek's guarantee was Keinei Lomei. Another interesting thing about this meeting is that in preparation for it, the Tzemach Tzedek wrote the Sefer Achkira in anticipation for the debate that they would have. And he assumed it's going to be theological and about religion and about faith. The Tzemach Tzedek wrote a book called Sefer Achkira, which is in print, which means little the book of philosophy. And their notes, most of them are notes on the Rasag's first shar about belief proof that there's an Eibishter, and a variety of other things. He wrote these notes preparing himself for this meeting in Petersburg. These notes were never meant to be printed. In fact, there's a letter from the Rebbe, to Friedrich Rebbe, from Bichovsky, where he writes that when they were printing the Likutei Torah, the Maril gave the one who was printing the Likutei Torah the Ksavim of the Sefer Achkira and told them print it in the Yeshivas. The Tzemach Tzedek had told the Shliach to print the Likutei Torah that right before he leaves they should come into him, and he discovered these Ksavim. He told them not to print them, and he was minish. He punished the Maril because he didn't want these Ksavim, the Sefer Achkira, printed. In reality, it was printed by a non-Lubavitch Chabad Chosid, and then of course our Rebbe reprinted it, and more recently they reprinted it in Eisias Mirabois. But this Sefer Achkira, which is really commentary on works of philosophy, it discusses deep theological questions that Tzemach Tzedek wrote in anticipation of this Asif. Another little story that they tell, a maisaleh, an anecdote, is that of course they went on for 3 months, so they argued about a lot of things, a lot of conversations and so forth. One of the issues that came up was that there's a Maimeh Chazal that says, Tov shebegoyim k'tel. Tov shebegoyim k'tel is spelled Kuf Tes Vav Lamed, which means kill. So the government of Russia tained it. This is a religion of chesed. Tov shebegoyim k'tel. So the Rabbi of Volozhiner said, no. Toiv shebegoyim k'teil doesn't mean the best of the Gentiles you should kill, but the best of the Goyim are the Catholics. And they have to read k'teil with a tough rather than with a test. Toiv shebegoyim k'teil, the Catholic. So they screamed and said there's no such nusach. It doesn't say in the Gemara Toiv shebegoyim k'teil with a tough. It says Toiv shebegoyim k'teil with a test. So Rabbi of Volozhin said, let's bring a Gemara. Anyway, they went, they brought a Gemara, and they opened it up, and it said Toiv shebegoyim k'teil with a tough. Just the way he needed it. Now, Rabbi of Volozhin knew very well that there was no such girsa. He knew that the correct girsa was Toiv shebegoyim k'teil with a test. So when he saw in a Gemara, Schwarz auf Weiß, that it said Toiv shebegoyim k'teil with a tough, so when he went home, he started to look through different versions of the Shas, hoping to find the one in which was written Toiv shebegoyim k'teil with a tough. He couldn't find it. So the Tzemach Tzedek said, you think that was his idea? It was my idea. The whole idea of saying that Toiv shebegoyim k'teil should be with a tough, which means Catholic, as opposed to Toiv shebegoyim k'teil with a tes, which means kill, was the Tzemach Tzedek's idea. So the Tzemach Tzedek said that he couldn't tell a lie, so he planted the thought of the Rabbi of Volozhin in his head, and he equally planted in the Gemara a tof in a place where there had been a tes. And the Tzemach Tzedek had moedendik mesiras nefesh. Like I said, there's many other stories. This is bekitzer. Tzemach Tzedek had moedendik mesiras nefesh during this asifa. And when he came back from Petersburg, he was successful to a degree, but he was very, very, very exhausted. And a lot of the showiness of Hasidus, as I mentioned before, was cut back as a consequence, so that people were not paying so much attention to Lubavitch. Now, of course, the end of the story is that this influence of the more modern Jews did make its way into Russia, primarily after the Tzemach Tzedek passed away in the 1860s and 70s and 90s. By the time the revolution happened, there were a considerable number of Jews who were not frum, or at least had major emunah issues. But the Rabbeim, beginning with Alter Rebbe and the Rebbe of Tzemach Tzedek, fought as to the best of their abilities and beyond to see to it that the reform would make no inroads into Russia. And of course, the end of this is that there's a vort that the Welt sagt, that when they went home from this Asifa, the Chassidim learned something and the Misnagdim learned something. The Chassidim learned that by Misnagdim is dot tzadikim, and the Misnagdim learned that by Chassidim is dot go'onim. And the consequence of this Asifa was an incredible achdus between Chassidim and Misnagdim, which is an interesting and an important parsha. You know, cynically, I've asked my students over the years, who made peace between Chassidim and Misnagdim? Now, you're going to come along and say this, the opposite of peace between Chassidim and Misnagdim. But the Hepech HaShalom that we have now started in America. And it started specifically when the Frierdiker Rebbe made his campaign, Li'alter L'tshuva, Li'alter L'geyula. As soon as the Frierdiker Rebbe started talking about Mashiach, as if Mashiach is such a bad idea, the Misnagdim came out against it. That's already 70 years ago, 74 years ago, 75 years ago. But in the old country, Chassidim and Misnagdim were both very proud. The Misnagdim were proud to be Litvisha, Elimisha. The Chassidim were proud to be Chassidim, but there was a Shalom. This Shalom started by the Tzemach Tzedek. It's interesting. The Alter Rebbe fought what you would call a hot war with the Misnagdim. Not by choice. He had no choice. They were forcing him. And even during the lifetime of the Alter Rebbe, there's indications that the last years of the Alter Rebbe's Nesius, Reb Chaim Volozhiner was already writing and publicizing the idea that the Chassidim are Erlich Yidden and they can be trusted, not like they had thought originally, that they were Apokursim and so on. The Mittler Rebbe had a very interesting policy. The Mittler Rebbe was a Cold War policy. Chassidim should never talk to Misnagdim, never argue. Because he believed that if we won't talk about it, it'll dissipate, it'll go away completely. And the Mittler Rebbe was very religious, very extreme about this. Ad kedei kach, that if you had a chassid who lived in a city where there was no chassidish shtibel, so he told them to daven b'yechidus, rather daven alone than go into a misnagdish shtul and have arguments with people. And he told them that for kriyas hatera they should stand through the window and listen, but they shouldn't go into the shuls. And he did everything he could to see to it that the machlekes chassidim and misnagdim would end. But at Tzemach Tzedek they became real sholem into chassidim and misnagdim. And like I said before, I asked my students what created the sholem to chassidim and misnagdim, and I'm sorry to say it, to a certain degree, on a level of das tachne, was the reform. The common enemy, so to speak, of Chassidim and Misnagdim, of the reform made Chassidim and Misnagdim realize that their differences are minor, and they joined forces together to fight against the Misnagdim. And for many, many years afterwards, there was certainly a respect, and maybe even an affection between Chassidim and Misnagdim, and on a Das Tachton level, one of the things which created this unity was the fact that we had joined together to fight against the reform. Just want to say one more thing in closing, that Tzemach Tzedek built a whole network of yeshivas. We all know about Temchet Mimim and the unique role Temchet Mimim played. But during the lifetime of the Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek, he made scores of yeshivas, many. Yeshivas, koilim, call them what you want. And there's a Reshima, I think, from Friedrich and Rebbe, where he lists the cities in which these yeshivas existed, and the names of the head mashpia of these yeshivas. And the way it was set up was that if there was a Yid who was himself proficient in Nigla and Chassidus, he would manage the yeshiva all by himself. Otherwise, they would hire somebody to manage the Nigla and the Mashpia, who would be the head of the yeshiva, who would manage the Chassidus and the Avedis Hashem al Derech HaChassidus, and so forth and so on. The person who the Tzemach Tzedek appointed in Lubavitch to oversee this endeavor, to oversee this network, was his son-in-law. The Tzemach Tzedek had two daughters. One of his son-in-law's name was Rabbi Yitzchak. I'm assuming he was a descendant of Rabbi Yitzchak B'Ditchever. And he was a very big god. And the Tzemach Tzedek had given him the task to oversee this network of yeshivas, and he, so to speak, led the yeshiva in Lubavitch, and so on and so forth. And this also contributed to a significant amount of dissemination of Chassidus Chabad in Russia at that time. And we'll continue Mitzvah Hashem next time.
This class is brought to you by theyeshiva.net. Please help us continue the classes. Make even a small contribution at www.theyeshiva.net/donate.